Imagine a tiny vial of blood. A few drops, pulled from a fingertip, painless and cheap. Now imagine that this single vial could run hundreds of medical tests, detecting cancer, diabetes, and heart disease years before symptoms ever appear. This was the promise. It was a promise that valued a company at $9 billion. It was a promise that graced the covers of Fortune, Forbes, and Incorporated magazines. It was a promise that fooled statesmen, generals, and the savviest venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. But there was just one problem. The technology didn't work, not even close. This is the story of how a 19-year-old dropout built a castle in the sky, protected it with a fortress of lawyers and lies, and watched it all crumble in one of the most spectacular corporate implosions in history. This isn't just a business failure. It is a crime scene disguised as a startup. The year is 2003. Elizabeth Holmes, a sophomore at Stanford University, decides to drop out. She has an idea, or rather, a vision. She is terrified of needles, and she believes the entire medical establishment is ripe for disruption. She founds Theranos, a mashup of the words therapy and diagnosis. Her pitch is intoxicatingly simple: the democratization of healthcare. No more vials drawn from veins. No more waiting weeks for results. No more expensive labs. Just a pinprick and a black box called the Edison that would do it all in your own home. It was the kind of sci-fi future everyone wanted to believe in. And that desire, that desperate need for the impossible to be true, became her greatest weapon. In the early days, the deception was subtle. It was the standard fake-it-till-you-make-it culture that permeates the tech world. But as the years ticked by, and the chemistry failed to obey her commands, the culture shifted from optimism to delusion, and finally, to outright fraud. By 2010, the startup had burned through tens of millions of dollars. Yet the Edison device was essentially a useless box of spare parts. It overheated, it shattered blood cells, and its results were as reliable as a coin flip. But Holmes was a master of image. She adopted the black turtleneck of Steve Jobs. She lowered her voice to a baritone to command authority. She stared without blinking. She created a reality distortion field that made seasoned investors forget to ask for peer-reviewed data. When venture capitalists asked for audited financial statements or technical schematics, she told them that revealing how the magic trick worked would allow competitors to steal it. She framed due diligence as a lack of faith. And in the venture capital boom, lack of faith meant missing out on the next Apple. So, they stopped asking questions. They just wrote the checks. The deception reached a fever pitch when Theranos struck a deal with Walgreens. This was the turning point where a white-collar crime turned into a threat to public safety. Holmes and her partner, Sunny Balwani, rolled out these machines to real patients in Arizona. But because the Edison machines didn't work, they couldn't actually test the blood on them. So, what did they do? They secretly bought standard commercial analyzers from Siemens' massive machines that required full vials of venous blood and hacked them to run on the tiny samples diluted with saline. It was a scientific impossibility. The results were wildly inaccurate. Patients were told they had HIV when they didn't. Others were told their blood thickening was fine when they were actually at risk of a stroke. Real lives were being gambled to keep the valuation high. Inside the company, the atmosphere was toxic. Balwani ran the operation like a dictatorship. Software engineers and chemists were siloed, unable to talk to each other. Security guards escorted employees to the bathroom. Anyone who raised a concern about the accuracy of the tests was fired on the spot and forced to sign draconian non-disclosure agreements. The board of directors was another masterpiece of misdirection. Holmes assembled a board not of medical experts or scientists, but of aging geopolitical titans. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, General James Mattis. These were men who knew about nuclear deterrence and foreign policy, but they knew absolutely nothing about blood chemistry. Their presence on the board served one purpose: legitimacy. Who would question a 19-year-old girl when the former Secretary of State was vouching for her? It was a shield of armor made of reputation, and it deflected scrutiny for years. But the armor had a crack. The grandson of board member George Shultz, a young man named Tyler Shultz, was working in the lab. He saw the doctored data. He saw the quality control checks being deleted. He saw the lies. When he tried to warn his grandfather, he was ignored. When he tried to warn Holmes, he was threatened. Enter John Carreyrou, a journalist for the Wall Street Journal. He got a tip, a simple tip that said, "It's all a lie." Carreyrou began to dig. He contacted former employees who were terrified to speak. He realized that the company's proprietary technology was a myth. When Theranos found out Carreyrou was investigating, they went on the offensive. They hired the most aggressive lawyer in the country, David Boies. They threatened to bankrupt the Wall Street Journal. They had private investigators follow Carreyrou and the whistleblowers. They ambushed Tyler Shultz at his grandfather's house, pressuring him to recant. It was a campaign of intimidation designed to bury the truth forever. But the story ran. In October 2015, the article hit the stands. hot startup Theranos has struggled with its blood test technology. The house of cards didn't fall immediately. It eroded. At first, Holmes went on television, defiant. She said, "First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then you change the world." She doubled down on the lie. But the regulators started looking. The FDA showed up unannounced. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspected the labs and found them to be an immediate jeopardy to patient health. The Walgreens deal collapsed. The investors, realizing they had been sold a phantom, sued. The valuation plummeted from $9 billion to zero. The genius who had graced the cover of Forbes as the youngest self-made female billionaire was now facing a dozen counts of federal wire fraud. The trial of Elizabeth Holmes peeled back the curtain on the psyche of a con artist. The defense argued that she was a naive dreamer who got in over her head, a victim of her own ambition and the influence of Balwani. The prosecution painted a different picture, a cold, calculating operator who knew exactly what she was doing. They showed texts where she discussed revenue projections for a product that didn't exist. They showed forged logos of pharmaceutical companies on validation reports. This wasn't a dream gone wrong. It was a deliberate, years-long scheme to defraud investors and patients. The jury agreed. The verdict was guilty. But why does this story matter? Why are we so obsessed with the rise and fall of Theranos? It's because it exposes a flaw in the modern economy. We have fetishized the genius founder. We want to believe in the lone savant who can break the laws of physics with sheer willpower. We have built a financial system that rewards hype over substance, where a good slide deck is worth more than a working prototype. Theranos wasn't an anomaly. It was the logical conclusion of a system that encourages startups to move fast and break things. The problem is, you can't move fast and break things when the thing you are breaking is a human being. The legacy of Theranos is a warning. It is a reminder that in science there are no shortcuts. You cannot code your way out of biology. You cannot market your way around chemistry. And no matter how charismatic the founder, no matter how famous the board members, no matter how high the valuation, the truth is the only metric that matters. Elizabeth Holmes wanted to be the next Steve Jobs. Instead, she became the face of the dark side of Silicon Valley. She proved that you can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool the data forever. The black box was empty. The genius was a ghost, and the $9 billion was nothing more than the price of admission to a theater of illusions. As we look at the next wave of startups promising to revolutionize AI, energy, and space travel, we have to ask ourselves, are we looking at the next iPhone, or are we looking at the next empty vial? The line between a visionary and a fraud is often just a matter of results, but the line between a startup and a crime is intent. Theranos didn't fail because it tried to do something hard. It failed because it decided that looking successful was more important than being successful. And in the end, that is the most expensive mistake anyone can make. The genius startup didn't just fool the world, it fooled itself. And the cost was everything.